Welcome to Ink and Evidence, where silence tells stories, and every clue brings us closer to the truth. From chilling crime cases to unsolved mysteries and secrets the world tried to forget, we uncover what lies beneath. If you dare to question, if you seek the truth, then you're exactly where you need to be. Tell us where you're watching this video from. Your feedback always inspires us. Stay tuned to solve the mystery, because the truth always leaves a trace.
Let's begin today's story, The Hidden Portrait at Nightingale House. Chapter 1. The question Miss Marple asked before entering Nightingale House. The first thing Miss Eleanor Finch noticed about Nightingale House was that no birds sang there. This was odd because the morning itself seemed made for birdsong. The hedges were wet with silver dew. The sky held that pale blue softness which comes after rain, and the long lane from Ashmere village wound gently between fields where larks ought to have risen. Yet as the motor car slowed before the iron gates, the air around the house remained strangely still. Miss Finch sat very upright, gloved hands folded over the clasp of her small leather case, and looked through the window. Nightingale House stood at the end of a gravel drive bordered by dark yews. It was an old house, not large enough to be grand and not small enough to be simple. Its gray stone front was softened by ivy, and tall narrow windows reflected the morning light without giving anything back. Above the central door, carved into weathered stone, was a nightingale with open wings. But the carving had been damaged. Someone had struck away the bird's head. "Here we are, miss," said the driver with relief. Miss Finch did not move at once. At the gate stood a young woman in a dark green coat, her face pale beneath the brim of her hat. She had clearly been waiting some time. One hand rested on the iron bars, and the other held a folded letter so tightly that the paper had bent at the edges. "That is Miss Clara Whitmore," said the driver. "Poor young lady, been trouble up at the house." "What sort of trouble?" Miss Finch asked gently. The driver hesitated. "Well, miss, depends who you ask. Some say Mr. Whitmore lost his mind before he died. Some say he saw something he shouldn't, and some say—" He stopped. Miss Finch turned her mild gray eyes upon him. "Some say what?" The driver lowered his voice. "Some say the portrait came back." Miss Finch said nothing. The gates opened with a long, reluctant groan. Clara Whitmore came forward quickly as Miss Finch stepped out. She was perhaps 28, with anxious eyes and the manner of someone who had recently learned that a house could listen. "Miss Finch." "Yes, my dear. I am so grateful you came. I know my letter must have sounded strange." "Strange letters are often the only honest ones," Miss Finch replied. Clara tried to smile but failed. "My uncle died 3 nights ago, Sir Alistair Whitmore. The doctor says it was his heart. Everyone says it was his heart." "And you do not?" Clara looked back at the house. "I don't know what I believe anymore." They walked up the drive together. Gravel whispered beneath their feet. Near the front steps, a gardener was trimming dead roses, though there were hardly any roses left to trim. He did not look up as they passed. Inside, Nightingale House was colder than the morning outside. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax, old stone, and something faintly medicinal. A clock ticked somewhere behind a closed door, slow and careful. On the walls hung portraits of Whitmore's long dead. Stern men in dark coats, pale women with pearl throats, children posed beside dogs that had outlived them only in paint. Yet one space on the wall was empty. A large rectangle of unfaded wallpaper showed where a painting had once hung. Miss Finch paused. Clara saw her looking. "That is where Lady Eveline's portrait used to be." "Used to be?" "It was removed 30 years ago." "By whom?" "My uncle." "And where is it now?" Clara's fingers tightened around the folded letter. "That is the trouble, Miss Finch. No one knows." A door opened at the far end of the hall. A tall woman in black silk appeared, composed and watchful. She had silver hair arranged with severe elegance and eyes that measured before they welcomed. "Miss Finch," she said, "I am Mrs. Beatrice Vale, Sir Alistair's sister." Miss Finch inclined her head. "I hope Clara has not alarmed you unnecessarily," Mrs. Vale continued. "Grief is an inventive thing." "Sometimes," said Miss Finch, "it merely notices what comfort prefers to ignore." Mrs. Vale's expression did not change. A second figure emerged behind her, a man of about 40, fair-haired, handsome in a tired way with restless hands. Clara introduced him as Julian Whitmore, Sir Alistair's nephew and heir. "We are grateful you have come," Julian said, though he did not sound grateful. "But I must say plainly that there is no mystery here. My uncle was old, he was ill, he died in his study." "With the door locked?" Miss Finch asked. Julian blinked. Clara looked sharply at her. "Yes," he said, "but Clara wrote that, I suppose." "She wrote very little," said Miss Finch. "That is why I came." Mrs. Vale's gaze moved to Clara. Before anyone could speak, another woman entered carrying a tea tray. She was stout, elderly, and neat as a pin, with red hands and a face trained into household silence. "This is Mrs. Pritchard," Clara said. "She has been with the family for years." 32, Mrs. Pritchard murmured. Miss Finch smiled kindly. "Then you must know the house better than anyone." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flicked toward the empty wall. "No one knows this house, miss, not truly." The teacups rattled faintly on the tray. Julian gave a strained laugh. "You see what Clara has done? She has infected everyone with nerves." "And the portrait?" Miss Finch asked. No one answered at once. At last, Clara unfolded the letter she had been holding and passed it to Miss Finch. "This was found beside my uncle after he died." The paper was thick, old, and yellowed at the edges. On it, written in a narrow, fading hand, were only 7 words. "Ask her why the Nightingale has no face." Miss Finch read it once, then again. Mrs. Vale turned away toward the window. Julian said, meaningless. "Was it in Sir Alistair's handwriting?" Miss Finch asked. "No," Clara whispered. "Lady Eveline S.," said Mrs. Pritchard. The room seemed to draw in a breath. Mrs. Vale spoke sharply. "That is impossible." "Lady Eveline has been dead for 30 years, Julian said. Miss Finch looked again at the empty place on the wall. "And yet," she said softly, "someone wished Sir Alistair to think of her before he died." Clara led Miss Finch to the study. It was a narrow room at the back of the house, overlooking a neglected garden where a stone fountain stood dry beneath a tangle of ivy. The desk remained as it had been found. A green-shaded lamp, a silver letter opener, an unfinished glass of water, a locked drawer. And above the fireplace hung another portrait. Sir Alistair Whitmore, painted in late middle age, his expression proud and deeply unhappy. Miss Finch moved slowly through the room. She touched nothing. Her eyes observed the carpet, the chair, the window latch, the ashes in the grate. Then she stopped before the fireplace. On the mantel, almost hidden beneath the shadow of the portrait frame, lay a single dark feather. Not a nightingale's feather. A painted feather. It was stiff, brittle, and edged with old varnish. Miss Finch lifted her eyes to Sir Alistair's portrait. At the lower corner of the canvas, where the frame had rubbed against the paint, something showed beneath the surface. A different color. A woman's blue sleeve. Miss Finch turned to Clara. "Before I entered this house," she said, "I wondered why no birds sang here." Clara's face had gone white. "And now," she whispered. Miss Finch looked once more at the hidden trace beneath Sir Alistair's portrait. "Now I wonder," she said, "whose face has been painted over." Chapter 2. Miss Marple arrives at Nightingale House beneath the autumn rain. Rain began before Miss Finch left the study. It came softly at first, brushing the windows with a sound like fingertips upon silk. Beyond the glass, the neglected garden blurred into gray and green, and the dry fountain seemed to darken under the weight of the weather, though no water flowed from its stone mouth. Clara stood near the desk, still looking at the painted feather in Miss Finch's gloved hand. "You think Sir Alistair's portrait is hiding another painting beneath it?" "I think," Miss Finch said gently, "that someone once wished very much for another face to disappear." Clara turned toward the portrait above the fireplace. In the dim autumn light, Sir Alistair's painted eyes seemed colder than before. "My uncle would never allow anyone to touch that portrait," she whispered. "Not even to clean it. Mrs. Pritchard used to dust the frame only when he was out of the room." "That is interesting. It frightened me when I was a child, not the painting itself, the way he watched people looking at it. Miss Finch did not answer at once. She placed the brittle painted feather carefully inside a folded handkerchief and slipped it into her case. A sharp knock sounded at the door. Julian entered without waiting. "I hope," he said, "that Clara has now shown you every shadow in the house." His smile was polite, but his eyes had gone to the mantel, then to Miss Finch's case. "Not every shadow," Miss Finch replied. "Only the ones that seem to have survived longest." Julian's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Vale has asked that you come to the drawing room. Tea is ready, and Dr. Marriott has arrived." "The doctor who attended Sir Alistair?" "Yes." "Then I shall be glad to meet him." They went together through the corridor, where the rain made the house feel narrower. Nightingale House did not welcome bad weather. It gathered it. Every window trembled softly. Every corner seemed to hold a little more darkness than was necessary. In the drawing room, Mrs. Vale sat upright beside the fire. Dr. Marriott stood near the hearth, warming his hands. He was a round, tired-looking man with kind eyes, though his kindness seemed strained by caution. "Miss Finch," he said, bowing slightly, "I understand you have questions. Only the kind that help silence unnecessary fears." Mrs. Vale looked into the fire. "Then perhaps you will begin by confirming there was no violence." Dr. Marriott hesitated. "No visible violence," he said. Julian turned sharply. "That is not what you said before." "It is exactly what I said before," the doctor replied with weary patience. "Sir Alistair's heart was weak. The shock of anything severe might have killed him." "What sort of shock?" Clara asked. Dr. Marriott removed his spectacles, cleaned them, and put them back on. "That I cannot say." Miss Finch accepted her tea, but did not drink it. "Was he frightened when you found him?" The room became still. Mrs. Vale's cup paused halfway to her lips. Dr. Marriott looked at Clara, then away. His expression was disturbed. "Disturbed," Julian repeated. "A dead man's expression proves nothing." "No," Miss Finch said, "but the living often work hard to explain it away." Julian rose and went to the window. Rain ran down the glass behind him, turning his reflection watery and uncertain. Mrs. Vale said, "My brother was not an easy man. He had moods, regrets. There is nothing criminal in that." "Regret may not be criminal," Miss Finch said, "but it is often a very faithful witness." At that moment, Mrs. Pritchard entered with fresh hot water. As she crossed the carpet, something white slipped from beneath the tray and fluttered to the floor. Clara stooped to pick it up. Mrs. Pritchard's face changed. "Leave that, miss." But Clara had already lifted it. It was a laundry slip, creased and damp at one corner. On it, in Mrs. Pritchard's careful hand, was written, "East room curtains, blue damask, stored attic." Miss Finch noticed only one thing. The word blue had been underlined twice. Mrs. Vale's voice cut across the room. "That is household business. Give it back." Clara passed it slowly to Miss Finch instead. "Blue damask," Miss Finch murmured. "Like a sleeve, perhaps." Mrs. Pritchard looked as though she might faint. Julian crossed the room in 2 strides. "This is absurd. Are we now investigating curtains?" "Sometimes," Miss Finch said, "fabric remembers what people do not." The doctor gave a small cough. "There was blue thread on Sir Alistair's sleeve when I examined him." No one spoke. The rain grew stronger. Clara whispered, "Why did you never mention that?" "Because it seemed nothing, a thread, the sort one gathers from furniture." "Or from a covered picture," Miss Finch said. Mrs. Vale stood. "Enough, this is becoming indecent." But Miss Finch was watching Mrs. Pritchard. The old housekeeper's eyes were fixed on the empty space above the hall, visible through the open drawing room door. "You know where the portrait went?" Miss Finch said softly. Mrs. Pritchard shook her head once. "No, miss." "Then you know where it did not go." Mrs. Pritchard's lips trembled. "I know only that Sir Alistair ordered it taken down. I know it was wrapped in blue damask. I know no servant was allowed to carry it beyond the east landing." "The east landing?" Clara repeated. Julian gave a short laugh. "There is no room beyond the east landing except storage." Mrs. Pritchard looked at him then, and something in her face made his laughter die. Miss Finch set down her cup. "I should like to see the attic." Mrs. Vale said, "Not today." "Why not?" "Because the roof leaks, the stairs are unsafe, and because this house is still in mourning." Miss Finch rose with that mildness which, in certain moments, became more difficult to oppose than command. "Mourning," she said, "is no reason to leave the dead alone with a lie." The attic stairs were narrow and smelled of dust, rainwater, and old wood. Clara carried a lamp. Julian followed, unwilling but watchful. Mrs. Pritchard came last, though twice she nearly turned back. At the east landing, the corridor ended before a tall linen cupboard. Its doors were locked. "Storage," Julian said. Miss Finch examined the lock. "Who has the key?" "Mrs. Pritchard," said Clara. The housekeeper did not move. Mrs. Vale's voice sounded from below, cold and clear. "Mrs. Pritchard, you will not open that cupboard." For a long moment, only the rain answered. Then Mrs. Pritchard reached into her apron pocket and took out a blackened key. "I am tired," she said, "of obeying the dead." The cupboard opened with a sigh of swollen wood. Inside were shelves of linen, old blankets, hat boxes, and rolled carpets. Nothing unusual. Julian exhaled impatiently. "There, are we satisfied?" Miss Finch lifted the lamp from Clara and held it higher. At the back of the cupboard, behind a stack of yellowing sheets, the wallpaper did not quite meet the floor. She knelt. There, low in the wood, was a narrow iron handle. Clara drew in a breath. Miss Finch pulled. A hidden panel opened inward, revealing darkness and a smell of cold air that had not moved for many years. From somewhere behind the wall came a faint sound. Not a voice, not footsteps, a slow, delicate tapping, like a fingernail upon glass. Julian whispered, "What is that?" Miss Finch held the lamp toward the black opening. On the floor just inside lay a strip of blue damask, freshly torn. And beside it, pressed into the dust, was a wet footprint. Chapter 3. The silent drawing room and the portrait no one could find. The wet footprint ended only 3 paces beyond the hidden panel. Miss Finch held the lamp lower, allowing its quiet circle of light to travel across the narrow passage. Dust lay thick against the walls, untouched except where the single footprint had disturbed it. The stone floor was uneven, and the ceiling so low that Julian instinctively bent his head. The tapping had stopped. Only the rain remained, softened now by layers of ancient brick. Clara looked over Miss Finch's shoulder. "It cannot simply disappear." "No," Miss Finch said quietly. "Footprints rarely choose to." She took another careful step. The passage widened unexpectedly into a small chamber hidden between the outer wall and the east wing. It was not a room anyone had intended to live in. It had neither fireplace nor proper window, only a narrow slit in the stone through which a pale ribbon of afternoon light entered. Shelves lined one wall. Most had collapsed beneath the weight of forgotten boxes. A wooden chair stood alone in the center of the room, its seat covered with a thin layer of dust. Except for one place. Someone had sat there recently. Julian frowned. This place should not exist. Mrs. Pritchard crossed herself almost without thinking. "I told Sir Alistair they should seal it forever." Miss Finch looked up. "They?" The housekeeper hesitated. "The builders, years ago." Before anyone could ask more, Clara noticed something near the chair. There, on the floor lay another painted feather. It matched the one Miss Finch had found upon the study mantel. She picked it up carefully. Again, old varnish clung to its edges. Again, it had clearly belonged not to a bird, but to a painting. Miss Finch turned slowly. "If 2 feathers have broken away." She allowed the sentence to remain unfinished. Julian followed her gaze. Against the far wall stood a large rectangular object covered by a faded linen cloth. His face brightened with sudden certainty. "The portrait." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled the covering away. It concealed only an old mirror. Its silver backing had blackened with age, leaving islands of reflection floating inside darkness. No portrait, only their own uncertain faces. Julian let the cloth fall. So much for hidden masterpieces. Miss Finch remained before the mirror. She did not look at her own reflection. Instead, she studied the frame. It was carved with branches and birds. Every bird possessed a face. Every bird except one. Near the upper corner, a single nightingale had been carefully scraped smooth, exactly like the stone carving above the front door. Someone had erased its head. Not broken it. Removed it deliberately. Clara whispered the same thing. Miss Finch touched the worn wood with one gloved finger. The same hand, perhaps. Behind them, Mrs. Pritchard had become unusually still. "You've seen this mirror before," Miss Finch said. The old woman closed her eyes. "It used to hang in the morning drawing room." "Why was it removed?" Sir Alistair could not bear looking into it. Julian laughed uneasily. "My uncle disliked mirrors. Everyone knows that." "No," Mrs. Pritchard murmured. "He disliked this one." Miss Finch turned. "What happened in the morning drawing room?" Mrs. Pritchard opened her mouth. Then footsteps sounded somewhere above them. Not loud. Only 3 slow steps. Everyone froze. Julian looked upward instinctively. "There is nothing above us." The footsteps came again. 3 measured sounds. Then silence. Clara gripped Miss Finch's sleeve. "I heard them." "So did I." Julian forced a smile that convinced no one. "The roof timbers." "No," Miss Finch said. "The rhythm was wrong." Without another word, she lifted the lamp and followed the passage farther inward. It curved gently before ending at an oak door. The door was bolted from their side. Its wood was newer than everything around it. Someone had replaced it within the last 10 years. Miss Finch examined the iron bolt. There were fresh scratches around it. Very fresh. She rested her fingertips upon the metal. Cold. Recently touched. Julian noticed her expression. "What is it?" "This door has been opened." "When?" "I cannot say." "But not long ago." Mrs. Pritchard stared at the bolt as though seeing it for the first time. "That cannot be. You have never opened it." "Never." "Who has?" No answer came. Only rain. Miss Finch did not lift the bolt. Instead, she stepped back. "Not today." Julian looked astonished. "Surely we cannot stop now." "We could," she said gently, "walk through that door. And we might lose the questions that will help us understand what lies beyond it." Clara smiled faintly. "You always wait." "I try to arrive before conclusions do." They returned to the attic in thoughtful silence. The hidden panel closed behind them with hardly a sound. By the time they descended to the main floor, evening had begun to gather around Nightingale House. The drawing room seemed darker than before. The fire had burned low. Mrs. Vale sat exactly where they had left her, reading a small leather-bound book. She closed it as they entered. "You found nothing." Julian hesitated. "A hidden chamber." Mrs. Vale's expression remained calm. "I know the house contains odd spaces." "And the mirror?" Clara asked. "A flicker. Almost invisible." "I had forgotten it." Mrs. Pritchard looked down. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Vale did not answer. Miss Finch walked quietly around the drawing room. Unlike every other room she had visited, this one felt unusually empty. Not physically, emotionally. She stopped before the fireplace. Above it hung a peaceful landscape of autumn trees reflected in a river. Its colors were warm. Its frame was expensive. It belonged perfectly, which was precisely why it disturbed her. She looked at the wall around it. Very faintly, beneath the paint, remained the outline of another frame. Larger, the landscape had replaced something else. Something taller. Mrs. Vale noticed where she was looking. That painting has hung there for years. Miss Finch nodded pleasantly. "Has it?" "It was my brother's favorite." "I wondered." Mrs. Vale folded her hands. What do you mean? I wonder whether it became his favorite after something else disappeared. Silence settled once more. Even the rain seemed to pause. Miss Finch crossed slowly toward the piano. Its polished lid reflected the firelight. A thin layer of dust rested across the keys. Except for 3 notes. Someone had played only those keys very recently. She pressed them gently. A soft chord floated into the room. Mrs. Pritchard gasped. Clara turned toward the window. "What is it?" "I thought." Outside, through the rain-streaked glass, a figure stood beneath the old yew tree. A woman. She wore a dark cloak. Her face could not be seen. For one long moment she remained perfectly still, looking toward the house. Then she lifted one gloved hand. Not in greeting, not in warning. She pointed toward the upper east window, the attic, and vanished into the rain before anyone reached the door. Julian hurried outside with a lantern, but returned alone. "No footprints." "Impossible," Clara whispered. "The ground is soaked." Miss Finch remained by the window. Her eyes had not followed the stranger. They rested instead upon the windowsill. There, glistening among the raindrops, lay a small brass object no larger than a coin. She picked it up carefully. It was not a coin at all. It was an oval nameplate, broken from the bottom corner of an old picture frame. Most of the engraved letters had been worn away by time. Only 2 remained clearly visible. VLINE. Chapter 4. The letter hidden behind the empty picture frame. Miss Finch turned the broken nameplate beneath the lamplight. The 2 remaining letters seemed very small, and yet the room had altered around them. Clara stared at them as though they had spoken aloud. Julian, still damp from the rain, stood near the door with the lantern hanging from one hand. Mrs. Pritchard's lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer. Only Mrs. Vale remained seated, though her fingers had tightened upon the arms of her chair. "Evelyn," Clara whispered. "No," Mrs. Vale said. The word came too quickly. Miss Finch looked at her. "No. It proves nothing. An old nameplate from an old frame. This house is full of useless relics." "Relics are rarely useless to the people who hide them," Miss Finch said. Julian set down the lantern. "Where did it come from?" "The windowsill." "Then the woman left it there." "Perhaps." "Why?" Miss Finch did not answer at once. She walked to the fireplace and held the brass plate near the landscape painting, comparing its size against the lower edge of the frame. It did not fit. The brass was older, narrower, and slightly curved from long attachment to a different molding. "No," she murmured, "not this frame." Clara's eyes moved toward the hall. The empty place. They went together, though Mrs. Vale did not rise. She remained in the silent drawing room, black against the firelight, listening as their footsteps moved away. In the entrance hall, the empty rectangle of wallpaper looked more distinct in the evening gloom. Miss Finch stood before it with the nameplate in her palm. Rain ticked faintly against the fanlight above the door. "Bring the lamp closer, my dear." Clara obeyed. The light revealed tiny holes along the lower edge of the faded mark where the portrait had once hung. Miss Finch lifted the brass plate. The holes matched. Mrs. Pritchard gave a small sound. It was hers. "Lady Evelyn's portrait hung here," Miss Finch said. "Yes." "And when it was taken down, the nameplate was removed." Mrs. Pritchard swallowed. Sir Alistair ordered it pried off before the frame was carried away. "Why? I did not ask." "No," Miss Finch said kindly, "but you remembered." The old woman looked away. Julian had gone pale. "The portrait is gone. The nameplate proves only that it once existed." "Indeed," Miss Finch said, "but someone found this piece recently. Someone knew we were looking for what had been taken." Clara looked toward the front door. The woman in the rain. At that moment, a gust moved through the hall, though every visible door was shut. The flame in Clara's lamp bent sideways. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. Not heavily, carefully, as if someone had shifted their weight. Julian looked up. There it is again. Miss Finch did not move. "Mrs. Pritchard," she said, When the portrait was removed, was the frame left empty? The housekeeper's face changed so slightly that Clara might have missed it. Miss Finch did not. No, miss. What was done with it? It was taken to the small morning room first. Sir Alistair told Mr. Vale to burn it. Julian frowned. My father. Yes, sir. But he never burned anything in the house. He hated smoke indoors. Mrs. Pritchard closed her eyes. That night there was smoke. Where? In the servants' yard. Miss Finch looked toward the passage leading past the kitchen. And did the frame burn? Mrs. Pritchard hesitated too long. I thought so. Thought. The canvas was gone by morning, the ashes were swept, but the frame, she looked at the empty space. A frame does not burn easily when the wood is old and the gilding thick. Miss Finch turned from the wall. Then we must find what remains of it. The servants' yard lay behind the house, reached through a narrow corridor that smelled of cold stone and extinguished fires. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, and the yard glistened under the lantern. Broken pots stood near the wall. A pump leaned crookedly beside a drain. Beyond it, a coal shed sat beneath a sloping roof. Mrs. Pritchard pointed. There. Inside the shed, the air was black with coal dust. Julian held the lantern high while Miss Finch examined the rear wall. Old timber, old nails, old shadows. Then Clara noticed a long, narrow board half buried behind 2 coal sacks. Is that part of it? Julian pulled the sacks aside. The board was gilded beneath its dirt. Along one edge clung scraps of rotted blue damask. On the back, the wood had not burned at all. Miss Finch brushed away the dust with her handkerchief. There was writing there. Not on the surface. Beneath it, a thin line showed where paper had been tucked into a crack between the frame and its backing. The paper had yellowed and curled, but it remained trapped, hidden from sight unless someone knew to look behind the empty picture frame. Clara held her breath as Miss Finch eased it free. It was a letter, old, folded twice, and sealed with dark wax that had long since cracked. No address, only 3 words written across the outside in a woman's hand. For Clara only. Clara stepped back as if struck. For me. You were not born when Lady Eveline disappeared, Julian said. Miss Finch studied the ink. Perhaps not for you, Miss Whitmore. Clara's face altered slowly. There was another Clara. Mrs. Pritchard turned away. My grandmother, Clara whispered. Clara Bell, she was Lady Eveline's companion. The rain whispered on the shed roof. Miss Finch held out the letter. Then it may belong to you in more ways than one. Clara's hands trembled as she broke the old seal. The paper opened reluctantly. She read the first lines in silence, then her voice failed. Julian took a step toward her, but Miss Finch lifted one hand. Let her. Clara swallowed and read aloud softly. If I do not return before morning, do not believe what Alistair tells them. The portrait must not be destroyed. It is the only witness left that cannot be frightened. Her voice broke. There is more. Miss Finch's eyes remained fixed on the letter. Clara continued. He thinks the face is the danger, but it is not the face. It is what Mr. Harrow painted behind my shoulder before he was sent away. Julian whispered, behind her shoulder. The rest of the page had been damaged by damp. Lines had blurred into pale brown stains. Only scattered words remained. The blue room. Not my child. The Nightingale without a face. Ask Beatrice. Clara stopped. Mrs. Pritchard began to weep without sound. Julian looked toward the house. Ask Beatrice. No one spoke the obvious thing. They did not need to. Miss Finch folded the letter carefully, but before she did, something slipped from between the pages and fell onto the coal-dusted floor. A small square of painted canvas, no larger than a playing card. It showed part of a woman's blue sleeve, and behind it in the dark background, the edge of another face. Not Lady Eveline, S. Not Sir Alistair, S. A young man's face, half hidden in shadow. Across the back of the fragment, written in the same faded hand, were 4 words. He was never dead. Chapter 5. footsteps above the gallery, and the locked artist's studio. The fragment lay in Miss Finch's gloved palm for several quiet moments before anyone spoke. Coal dust clung to its edges. The painted blue sleeve matched the color she had glimpsed beneath Sir Alastair Whitmore's portrait, and the faint outline of the young man's face seemed to emerge only when the lantern light caught it from the side. His features were indistinct, yet there was enough of him to make absence itself feel deliberate. Julian looked away first. It could be anyone. It could, Miss Finch agreed. But the words... She turned the fragment over once more. He was never dead. The words are easier to understand than to trust. Clara folded Lady Eveline's damaged letter with extraordinary care, as though every weakened fiber carried another sentence waiting to be recovered. If she believed someone lived. Miss Finch closed her case. I am more interested in why she believed someone wished the world to think otherwise. The rain had almost ceased by the time they crossed the servants' yard. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, each drop finding the stone below with patient precision. Night had settled over Nightingale House without wind. Even the trees stood perfectly still. As they entered the hall, Mrs. Vale was waiting. No one had heard her approach. She stood beneath the empty place where Lady Eveline's portrait had once hung, dressed in black, her hands loosely folded. You found something. It was not a question. Julian hesitated. Miss Finch answered gently. We found an old letter. Mrs. Vale's expression scarcely altered. From whom? A lady who expected not to return before morning. Silence spread between them. Mrs. Vale lowered her eyes briefly. Old letters seldom improve with age. No, Miss Finch said, they merely become more difficult to silence. For the first time since Miss Finch had arrived, Mrs. Vale appeared genuinely tired. There are matters buried in this house that deserve to remain buried. Perhaps, and perhaps not every truth is an act of kindness. Miss Finch regarded her quietly. I have found that hidden truths are rarely kinder than spoken ones. Mrs. Vale turned away. Do as you wish. She walked toward the west corridor without another word. Mrs. Pritchard watched her disappear. She never used that passage. When did she begin? Asked Miss Finch. After Sir Alastair died. Miss Finch said nothing, but she remembered. Later that evening, supper passed with little conversation. Silver cutlery touched china softly. The great dining room seemed too large for its occupants. Rainwater slid occasionally from the gutters outside, and the grandfather clock measured each passing minute with almost ceremonial gravity. Clara scarcely ate. Julian drank more wine than he intended. Mrs. Vale remained composed, though once Miss Finch noticed her glance toward the ceiling. Not upward generally, toward one particular place. When the meal had ended and coffee had been served in the drawing room, the sound came again. 3 footsteps, slow, measured, directly overhead. Every conversation ceased. Julian set down his cup. There, no one questioned whether they had heard them. The footsteps crossed the ceiling once, stopped, then resumed. Miss Finch listened with her head slightly inclined. Not the attic. Clara looked up. No, the gallery. Julian frowned. There is nothing above the drawing room except the long gallery. And beyond it, the old north studio. Mrs. Pritchard's spoon slipped from her hand. Its small sound upon the saucer seemed unnaturally loud. No one goes there. Miss Finch looked toward her. Why, the door has been locked since. She stopped. Since when? Mrs. Vale answered instead. Since the painter disappeared. The room became still again. Miss Finch spoke quietly. Mr. Harrow. Mrs. Vale neither confirmed nor denied it. He rented the studio while painting my sister. The portraits, plural. Miss Finch noticed the word. You sat for him as well. Mrs. Vale stared into the fire. We all did. Julian rose abruptly. This is becoming absurd. Is it? The studio has been locked for 30 years. Who has the key? No one. Mrs. Pritchard looked uncomfortable. There was a key. Sir Alistair kept it. And now, we never found it. Miss Finch smiled almost imperceptibly. Keys have curious habits. Julian sighed. You think someone has been entering the studio. I think someone has been walking above us. Lanterns were fetched. The gallery stretched the length of the upper floor, lined with portraits whose varnished faces caught the trembling light as the little group advanced. Every painted eye seemed fixed upon them. Outside, the moon appeared briefly through thinning clouds before vanishing again. The gallery floor creaked gently beneath careful footsteps. Halfway along, Miss Finch stopped. There, a faint trail crossed the dust. Not footprints. Something narrow had been dragged recently across the polished boards. Julian knelt. A trunk. Perhaps. It leads to the studio. Indeed it did. The marks ended before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron straps. Its brass handle had dulled with age. The keyhole was black. Above the lintel, almost hidden beneath cobwebs, someone had carved a tiny nightingale. Its head had been cut away. Clara whispered, "Again." Miss Finch touched the carving lightly. The same symbol. Mrs. Pritchard folded her hands tightly. It wasn't like that when I was young. No, it had a face. Julian grasped the handle. Locked. He shook it firmly. Nothing. The key is gone. Miss Finch crouched before the lock. Fresh scratches. Not many. Only enough to suggest repeated attempts. Someone else had already tried to enter. Or leave. She examined the dust below the threshold. One place had been disturbed. Not by a shoe. By folded paper pushed beneath the gap. There was something here. Clara knelt beside her. A letter? Perhaps. It isn't here now. No. Julian looked down the empty gallery. Then someone collected it. A faint breeze moved unexpectedly along the corridor. Every lantern flame leaned toward the studio door. Mrs. Pritchard gave a frightened glance behind them. I don't like this. Miss Finch stood. Fear often arrives a few moments before understanding. As she spoke, a soft sound drifted through the locked door. Not footsteps. Not voices. The unmistakable scrape of a chair being moved across wooden floorboards. Everyone heard it. Julian's face drained of color. There is someone inside. He struck the door with his shoulder. The old oak shuddered but held. Again. Nothing. Stand back, he said. Miss Finch did not move. Instead, she walked to the nearest gallery window. It overlooked the north side of the house. The studio occupied the corner beyond. She opened the casement. Cold night air entered. The ivy climbed almost to the studio windows. One of them stood slightly open. Very slightly. Enough for a curtain to stir. There, Clara breathed. Julian hurried to the window. But we're on the second floor. Miss Finch's gaze followed the thick ivy downward. Broken stems. Freshly broken. Someone had climbed recently. A faint light flickered once behind the studio curtain. Then vanished. Julian turned back toward the locked door. We must break it. Miss Finch remained strangely calm. If we do, whoever was inside will already be gone. Then what do we do? She looked once more toward the dark studio window. Something pale rested upon the outer stone ledge. Not cloth. Not paper. White lilies. A single small bouquet, still fresh despite the rain. Tied with faded blue ribbon. Wrapped around the stems was a narrow strip of canvas. Even from the gallery window, Miss Finch could see 4 words painted carefully upon it in dark blue pigment. She posed alone last. Chapter 6. Miss Marple notices what everyone else overlooks. No one spoke for several moments. The bouquet rested upon the narrow stone ledge beyond the studio window, untouched by the wind. The white lilies seemed impossibly fresh against the dark ivy, and the faded blue ribbon that bound them fluttered only faintly in the night air. Julian leaned farther through the gallery window. It could not have been there this afternoon. No, Miss Finch replied. Someone wished it to be found. And the message? She looked once more at the strip of painted canvas. She posed alone last. It is less a statement than an invitation. To what? To ask why someone wishes us to believe it. Julian looked back toward the locked studio door. You think it may not be true. I think truths delivered anonymously deserve company before they deserve trust. Clara smiled faintly despite herself. It was the first hint of warmth that had crossed her face since Miss Finch had arrived. Mrs. Pritchard, however, continued to stare at the lilies. No one in this house would bring white lilies. Why not? Clara asked. The old housekeeper hesitated. Lady Evelyn disliked them. Silence followed. Did everyone know that? Miss Finch asked. Oh yes, miss. Then whoever left them either knew she disliked them, or wished us to think they knew, Clara finished quietly. Miss Finch inclined her head. Exactly. She closed the gallery window, leaving the bouquet undisturbed outside. We shall collect it in daylight. Julian looked astonished. Leave it there. If someone wishes us to hurry, I generally prefer not to oblige. The little party began walking slowly back along the gallery. Portraits emerged and disappeared in the lantern light. Ancestors whose names had faded from memory continued watching the living with calm indifference. Halfway down the corridor, Miss Finch stopped. Not because of a portrait. Because of the carpet. It was a long Persian runner, faded by decades of footsteps. At first glance, it appeared perfectly ordinary. She bent slightly. What is it? Clara whispered. Miss Finch did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted one edge of the carpet, no more than an inch. A narrow strip of polished oak appeared beneath. Unlike the surrounding floorboards, it carried almost no dust. Julian frowned. Someone moved the carpet. Frequently. Why would anyone do that? Miss Finch laid it back exactly as she had found it. I wondered. She continued walking. A few yards farther on, she stopped again. The wall beside the third portrait from the end bore tiny scratches at shoulder height. Not random marks. Parallel, as though something broad had been carried repeatedly around the corner. A large frame, Clara murmured. Perhaps. Julian examined them. They're old. Some are. Miss Finch pointed to one brighter line in the wood. This one isn't. Mrs. Pritchard looked troubled. I don't remember seeing that. No, Miss Finch said gently. Because one seldom notices a scratch until looking for the object that made it. They descended to the drawing room. The fire had burned low, leaving soft amber light among deepening shadows. Mrs. Vale had not moved far. She now stood beside the piano, one hand resting upon its polished lid. You accomplished nothing. It sounded almost hopeful. Miss Finch smiled politely. I noticed several things. Mrs. Vale regarded her steadily. I have found that people who notice too much often become unhappy. Sometimes, and yet you continue. There are unhappier things than noticing. Mrs. Vale's eyes drifted briefly toward the fireplace landscape. So there are. The conversation ended there. Later, after everyone had retired, Nightingale House settled into its familiar silence. Miss Finch remained awake. Her bedroom overlooked the neglected fountain. Moonlight filtered through passing clouds, silvering the wet stone paths below. She did not read. Instead, she replayed the day in her thoughts. The carved nightingales, the missing portrait, the blue sleeve, the hidden passage, the lilies, the repeated removal of birds' faces. One detail refused to leave her. Not because it was remarkable, because nobody else had remarked upon it at all. She rose quietly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and took her candle into the corridor. The house after midnight possessed a gentler silence than during the day. Old timber sighed softly. Rainwater dripped from distant gutters. Somewhere a clock struck 1. She walked not toward the attic, nor toward the gallery. Instead, she descended to the entrance hall. The empty place where Lady Eveline's portrait had once hung waited in darkness. Miss Finch held her candle close. Earlier, everyone had looked at the faded rectangle upon the wall. No one had looked beneath it. She knelt. Along the skirting board ran a faint line of tiny brass tacks. Not enough to support a painting. Enough to secure heavy fabric. Blue damask. She smiled to herself. So, someone had once hung a curtain before the portrait. Not to protect it. To conceal it. She followed the line of tiny tack holes several feet along the wall. They ended beside the grandfather clock. Miss Finch examined the polished wood. Nothing. Then she noticed the floor. One oak board was worn differently from the rest. Its grain had darkened where countless feet had stopped in precisely the same place. Not crossed. Stopped. She stood upon it. Nothing happened. She stepped away. Again, nothing. Yet the board remained curious. Very gently, she tapped it with the handle of the candle holder. Solid, then hollow. Only one corner. She crouched lower. There, hidden beneath years of polish, lay the smallest of finger holes. Someone had fashioned a removable panel into the floor itself. Before she could examine it further, she heard movement behind her. Not footsteps. Breathing. She turned. Mrs. Pritchard stood at the end of the hall wearing a gray shawl over her nightdress. I thought I'd find you here. You couldn't sleep. The old housekeeper shook her head. I never sleep well when people begin asking about Lady Eveline. She came slowly closer. For a while neither woman spoke. Finally Mrs. Pritchard said, Sir Alistair wasn't always cruel. I did not suppose he was. He laughed once. I believe that too. The old woman's eyes filled. Whatever happened here, it broke more than one person. Miss Finch waited. Mrs. Pritchard glanced toward the empty wall. People think the portrait mattered because of the woman painted on it. She lowered her voice. But they were looking at the wrong person. Miss Finch felt something settle quietly into place inside her thoughts. The background. Mrs. Pritchard looked startled. You knew. I suspected. The old woman nodded slowly. He never cared about Lady Eveline's face. No, he cared about what stood behind her. Mrs. Pritchard pressed trembling fingers together. There was another figure. Yes, only part of him. Yes, but after the painting returned from the studio. She stopped abruptly. Miss Finch looked at her with calm patience. Returned. Mrs. Pritchard covered her mouth. For several seconds, she seemed unable to breathe. I shouldn't have said that. Returned from where? No, Mrs. Pritchard. The old woman backed away. I've already said too much. She turned and hurried toward the servants' corridor. Halfway there she froze. A soft metallic sound echoed through the sleeping house. Not from above. Not from outside. From beneath the floor where Miss Finch stood. Both women stared downward. Slowly, very slowly, the hidden wooden panel lifted by less than half an inch from below. And someone, unseen beneath the floorboards, gently slid a folded envelope through the opening before the panel closed again in perfect silence. Chapter 7. The confession that solved nothing at Nightingale House. The envelope remained where it had been pushed through the narrow opening, resting upon the polished floorboards as though it had always belonged there. Neither Miss Finch nor Mrs. Pritchard moved at once. The silence that followed seemed almost courteous, allowing whoever lay beneath the floor enough time to withdraw unseen. At last Miss Finch stepped forward and knelt. The hidden panel had settled perfectly back into place. There was no visible gap now, only the faint outline she had already discovered. She placed her fingertips against the wood. It was cool. No sound came from below. She lifted the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, and entirely unsealed. No name appeared upon it, no crest. Only a faint scent of linseed oil and old varnish clung to the paper. Mrs. Pritchard whispered, "They know you're here." Miss Finch looked up. "Someone does." She withdrew a single folded sheet. The handwriting was firm, masculine, and unexpectedly elegant. It contained only one sentence. "You are asking about the wrong confession. Nothing more. No signature. No date." Miss Finch turned the page over. Blank. Mrs. Pritchard pressed one trembling hand against the wall. "I don't understand." "No," Miss Finch said softly. "Neither, I think, does the person who sent it." The old housekeeper stared. "What do you mean?" "If they wish to stop me, they have instead encouraged me." She folded the note carefully into her case. "Come, it is late." Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. "You aren't frightened?" Miss Finch smiled. "I generally become concerned only when people stop leaving messages." They returned quietly to their rooms, though sleep visited neither of them quickly. Morning arrived beneath a pale autumn mist. The rain had gone, leaving Nightingale House washed clean yet somehow more secretive than before. Moisture clung to every yew branch. The fountain reflected a colorless sky. Somewhere beyond the gardens, a rook called once and then fell silent. At breakfast, the atmosphere had altered. Julian appeared exhausted. Mrs. Vale looked unusually composed. Clara watched everyone without seeming to. Miss Finch buttered a piece of toast with great concentration. No one mentioned the envelope. Instead, Julian cleared his throat. "I've made a decision." Mrs. Vale continued pouring tea. "I've asked Mr. Henry Latham to come." Clara looked surprised. "The solicitor?" "Yes." Mrs. Vale finally looked up. "There is no need." "There may be." Julian's voice lacked its usual confidence. "If these stories continue, if questions about Uncle continue, we should settle matters properly." Mrs. Vale stirred her tea without drinking it. "As you wish." Miss Finch noticed something curious. Julian had expected resistance. Instead, he had received permission. And that disappointed him. Breakfast ended quietly. As the others dispersed, Clara approached Miss Finch near the library door. "I dreamt about the portrait." Miss Finch regarded her kindly. "What happened?" "I never saw Lady Evelyn." "No, I only saw someone standing behind her." Miss Finch smiled faintly. "Dreams have a habit of borrowing from the day." "I know." Clara lowered her voice. "But I've never seen his face before." Miss Finch did not ask whose face. She suspected Clara could not have answered. Near midday, the solicitor arrived. Henry Latham proved to be a thoughtful man in his 60s, carrying a leather dispatch case polished by many years of careful use. He greeted everyone politely before asking to speak in Sir Alistair's study. The request itself seemed ordinary. What followed did not. Within half an hour, raised voices drifted into the corridor. Julian's voice. Mrs. Vale's. Then sudden silence. The study door opened. Julian emerged first. His face had become almost colorless. He saw Miss Finch waiting nearby and gave a short, weary laugh. "Well," she waited. "I suppose you've heard enough already." "I have heard voices." He looked toward the closed study. "My aunt has decided to confess." Miss Finch remained still. "To what?" "Everything." The word echoed strangely. "Everything." Julian shook his head. "I almost wish she hadn't." Without another explanation, he walked away. A few minutes later, Mrs. Vale herself opened the study door. "You wish to understand this house?" "I do." "Then come." The room smelled faintly of old books and extinguished fire. Henry Latham stood beside the window, looking deeply uncomfortable. On the desk lay several faded account books and a small locked cash box. Mrs. Vale did not sit. Instead, she stood before Sir Alistair's portrait. "I shall save everyone a great deal of trouble." Her voice remained perfectly steady. "I removed Lady Eveline's portrait." No one interrupted. "I ordered the frame hidden." Another pause. "I instructed Sir Alistair never to display it again." Henry Latham closed his eyes briefly. Mrs. Vale continued. "I destroyed documents." She folded her hands. "I lied repeatedly over many years." Julian stared. "You admit all this?" "Yes." "And why?" Mrs. Vale looked toward the portrait above the fireplace. "Because I wish to protect my family." Silence settled over the study. Miss Finch spoke at last. "Whom were you protecting?" "My brother." "From what?" Mrs. Vale answered without hesitation. "From disgrace." Julian looked bewildered. So Uncle really was guilty. Mrs. Vale met his eyes. "Yes." "Guilty of what?" A longer silence followed. Then she said quietly, "Everything." Henry Latham shifted uneasily. Miss Finch's expression did not change. Instead, she walked slowly across the room until she stood beside the window. Outside, the neglected fountain shimmered beneath drifting leaves. "You are very generous," she said. Mrs. Vale frowned. "I beg your pardon." "You have confessed to many actions." "I have, but not to a single event." Mrs. Vale remained silent. Miss Finch continued gently. "You removed the portrait." "Yes." "You hid the frame." "Yes." "You destroyed papers." "Yes." But none of these tells us why Lady Eveline wrote her letter. Mrs. Vale said nothing. None explains the painted-over figure. Silence. None explains the hidden passage. Silence again. None explains why someone beneath the floor sent me a message last night. Julian looked sharply toward Miss Finch. Mrs. Vale's eyes widened only slightly. "Enough." Miss Finch noticed. "You see," she said softly, "your confession explains behavior." She looked kindly at Mrs. Vale. "It explains almost nothing else." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Mrs. Vale's composed face. She had expected disbelief. She had not expected incompleteness. Henry Latham cleared his throat. "There is one more matter." Everyone turned. The solicitor unlocked the small cash box with a key taken from his waistcoat. Inside lay Sir Alistair's final written instructions. Not a will. A note. Henry unfolded it carefully. "It directs me," he said slowly, "to deliver one item only if Miss Eleanor Finch ever entered Nightingale House." Julian stared. "My uncle knew she would come." "So it would appear." Henry reached into the box. He withdrew a long brass key wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Attached to it hung a small ivory label. In Sir Alistair's unmistakable handwriting were 7 carefully written words. Not the studio, the room beyond the studio. Chapter 8. The secret hidden behind the forgotten portrait. Henry Latham placed the brass key into Miss Finch's hand with the quiet care of a man surrendering something he had never wished to possess. It was heavier than it appeared. The blue ribbon wrapped around its stem had once been bright, but years had softened it to the color of mist. One end had been repaired with 3 careful stitches made in pale thread. Miss Finch noticed them immediately. Someone mended the ribbon. Henry nodded. Sir Alistair did. He repaired it instead of replacing it. He was quite particular. Miss Finch turned the key slowly between her fingers. People rarely mend what they intend to forget. Mrs. Vale looked away toward the rain-washed garden. "No," she murmured, "they mend what they cannot bear to lose." No one spoke after that. The room seemed unwilling to disturb the silence that had settled around the old key. At last Julian said quietly, "If there truly is a room beyond the studio, Why would Uncle never tell us? Miss Finch slipped the key into her coat pocket. Perhaps because he hoped no one would ever need to enter it. The afternoon passed beneath a pale, shifting sky. Clouds drifted slowly over Nightingale House, leaving alternating pools of sunlight and shadow across the lawns. Damp leaves released the scent of earth. The neglected fountain gathered a few fallen sycamore seeds that turned gently in the shallow rainwater collected within its basin. Miss Finch wandered alone through the gardens. Not because she expected to discover anything, because gardens often allowed thoughts to arrange themselves. She paused beside the dry rose beds. The gardener was there again, trimming stems that no longer required trimming. His movements were slow, methodical. He had scarcely looked up since her arrival at the house. "Good afternoon." The elderly man removed his cap. "Afternoon, miss. You've cared for these gardens many years." 43. Long enough to remember Lady Eveline. His shears stopped. "I remember everyone. You were here when Mr. Harrow painted." "Yes. And afterward." Another pause. The gardener studied a rose cane before cutting it. "People talk about portraits." "They do. They ought to talk more about gardens." Miss Finch smiled. "Why? Paintings stay where they're hung." He looked toward the north wing. "Gardens don't." She waited. The old man lowered his voice. "There used to be another path." "Where?" "It ran beneath the studio windows." "I see no path." "No." He resumed trimming. "It was dug up." "By whom?" "Sir Alistair." "Why?" "He said roots had broken the stones." "And had they?" The gardener finally met her eyes. "No." "What had?" The shears closed once with a crisp metallic sound. "I never asked." Miss Finch thanked him and continued walking. When she reached the place beneath the studio, she found only damp grass. Yet the gardener had been correct. The ground dipped ever so slightly in a narrow line that curved toward the eastern wall before disappearing beneath ivy. Someone had altered the landscape with considerable care. Not enough for casual visitors to notice. Enough for someone wishing to erase a root. She marked it carefully in her mind. By late afternoon, they gathered once more before the locked studio. The long gallery seemed brighter now, though only because daylight entered through the high windows. The bouquet of lilies had been brought inside. It rested upon a side table. The blue ribbon remained tied exactly as before. Julian examined the brass key. "So this should open the studio." Miss Finch shook her head. "The label says otherwise. The room beyond. But we cannot reach a room beyond unless we first enter the studio." Mrs. Pritchard stood uneasily near the staircase. "I've never known anyone go in." Mrs. Vale remained several steps behind the others. She neither encouraged nor objected, only watched. Julian inserted the key into the old lock. It did not fit. He frowned. "It isn't for this door." Miss Finch had expected as much. She examined the iron straps once again. Fresh scratches still surrounded the lock. But something else caught her attention now. The hinges. Every previous conversation had concerned the lock. No one had looked at the hinges. She crouched. 3 heavy iron hinges secured the studio door. The upper 2 were thick with rust. The lowest was not. Someone had removed it within recent years. The screw heads were newer. She stood. "The door has been rehung." Julian looked puzzled. Why would anyone do that? To replace damaged hinges? Or to take the door off entirely? Silence. Mrs. Pritchard's face slowly paled. "You mean, at some point this locked door was no obstacle at all?" Julian stared at it differently now. If the door came off, anything inside could leave. Or enter. Miss Finch nodded. And no key would have been required. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Unable to open the studio, they returned reluctantly downstairs. Evening settled early. A fire burned quietly in the morning drawing room, the room from which the old mirror had once been removed. Miss Finch wandered there alone while the others prepared supper. Unlike the larger drawing room, this chamber felt strangely unfinished. One wall bore faint rectangular shadows where paintings had once hung. Another contained a tall bookcase with glass doors. Very few books remained. Instead, shelves held porcelain birds collected over generations. Robins, swallows, blackbirds, thrushes, every one beautifully preserved. Except the nightingales. There were 4 porcelain nightingales. Each had its head broken away. Miss Finch stood very still. Not smashed by accident. Removed carefully. Always at the neck. Always the head missing. She reached toward the nearest figure. Its broken edge had darkened with age. Someone had done this many years before. Behind her came the quiet sound of footsteps. Clara. She stopped beside Miss Finch. I never noticed. No, they've always been like this. Which is precisely why no one sees them. Clara touched one gently. Who would do such a thing? I wonder whether the question is slightly different. She turned toward Clara, who wished no one to remember what a nightingale looked like. Clara frowned. I don't understand. Neither do I. Miss Finch looked around the room once more. Then her gaze settled upon the bookcase. One shelf held no porcelain at all. Only a narrow gap where something rectangular had once stood. Dust outlined its shape perfectly. Not a book. A frame. Very small. She opened the glass door. The shelf was otherwise empty. Except, far at the back rested a tiny brass hook. Almost invisible. She reached inside. The hook moved. A soft click echoed within the wood. The entire rear panel of the bookcase shifted inward less than an inch. Clara gasped. Miss Finch gently pulled. The hidden compartment opened. Inside there was no portrait. No diary. No jewels. Only a flat parcel wrapped in faded blue damask. The same fabric. The same careful folds. Across the cloth, written in Lady Eveline's unmistakable hand, were 6 quiet words. Do not unwrap this without sunlight. As Clara stared at the parcel, the evening sky beyond the windows darkened beneath gathering clouds. By the time morning came, there might be no sunlight at all. Chapter 9. The night Miss Marple finally understood the hidden portrait. The parcel rested upon the table between them like a promise that had learned patience. No one reached for it. The blue damask, faded by decades, had been folded with extraordinary care. Its corners met with almost mathematical precision, and the knot securing it had not tightened with age. It had been tied by hands that expected another pair of hands to untie it one day. Outside, the last of the evening light vanished behind a bank of low autumn clouds. Clara looked anxiously toward the windows. If tomorrow is overcast. Miss Finch traced one gloved finger a short distance above the cloth without touching it. Then we wait. Julian gave a weary sigh. We have waited for 30 years. And one more night is unlikely to damage the truth. Mrs. Vale stood in the doorway. Her eyes rested upon the parcel for only a heartbeat before she quietly turned away again. That more than anything she had said held Miss Finch's attention. She had not looked surprised. She had looked relieved. The house settled early. Clouds covered the moon. No rain fell, yet the air carried the cool heaviness that often comes before dawn storms. Somewhere beyond the yew trees, an owl called only once. Miss Finch remained awake. The unopened parcel lay upon the writing desk in her room. She had extinguished every lamp except one. Not because she feared the darkness. Because light, she had begun to suspect, mattered very much to whoever had hidden the portrait. She took from her case each clue collected during the past days. The painted feather, The brass nameplate, the torn fragment showing the blue sleeve, Lady Eveline's damaged letter, the anonymous note pushed beneath the floor, the strip of canvas tied around the lilies. She arranged them carefully, not in the order they had been discovered, in the order they had been created. After several quiet minutes, she smiled almost imperceptibly. So, there had never been one mystery. There had always been two. Someone had hidden a portrait. Someone else had been trying to preserve it. Those two people were not the same. The realization brought with it another. She reached for the painted feather. It had bothered her from the beginning. Not because it had fallen from a painting. Because it had fallen twice. She held both painted feathers side by side. They matched perfectly, except they did not. One carried tiny flecks of green paint near its base. The other carried faint traces of gold. Different paintings, different birds. Miss Finch leaned back. Everyone had assumed the feathers belonged to Lady Eveline's missing portrait. No one had proved it, including herself. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara entered quietly. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. Clara noticed the clues spread across the desk. You've discovered something. Only that I have been asking one incorrect question. What question? I have asked where the hidden portrait is. She looked toward the unopened parcel. I should have been asking which hidden portrait. Clara frowned. You think there was more than one. I think someone wished us to believe there was only one. Silence followed. Then Clara said softly, My grandmother once told me something strange. Miss Finch waited. She said painters sometimes hide truth with paint. That is true, but she said great painters hide lies the same way. Miss Finch looked thoughtfully toward the dark window. Yes, they simply decide which layer people will believe. Near midnight, another sound drifted through the sleeping house. Not footsteps. Music. Very faint. Only 3 piano notes. The same 3 notes Miss Finch had tested days earlier. She and Clara exchanged a glance. Neither spoke. They carried only one candle between them as they descended the staircase. The entrance hall lay empty. The music had ceased. The drawing room door stood slightly open. Miss Finch pushed it gently. Inside, the fire had burned to glowing embers. The piano stood where it always had. No one sat before it. Yet one key still moved almost imperceptibly, settling after recent use. Julian entered from the opposite corridor, hastily dressed. You heard it? Yes. I searched the west wing. Nothing. No one. Mrs. Pritchard appeared next, wrapped tightly in a shawl. Her frightened eyes moved immediately to the piano. No one has touched that instrument at night since. She stopped herself. Miss Finch crossed the room. Instead of examining the keys, she looked beneath the piano. Dust, undisturbed. Then she looked upward. The lid. Something white rested upon the polished wood. A folded page. She lifted it. Not music. A sketch, executed rapidly in charcoal. It showed the long gallery, the locked studio door, and beside it, almost hidden among the shadows, another door. A narrow one, without a handle, without hinges, drawn directly into the wall itself. At the bottom of the sketch appeared 6 penciled words. The painter never used the stairs. Julian stared. There is no second door. Miss Finch said nothing. Instead, she looked at the gallery as it had been drawn. Not at the walls. At the windows. There were 5. She closed her eyes briefly. There are only 4. Clara blinked. What? In the gallery. There have always been 4 windows. Yes. Miss Finch tapped the charcoal drawing. But whoever made this sketch remembered 5. Mrs. Pritchard whispered, There used to be. The words escaped before she could stop them. Everyone turned toward her. There used to be what? The old housekeeper's shoulders sagged. A fifth window. Julian stared in disbelief. There has never been a fifth window. Mrs. Pritchard looked toward the ceiling. There was. What happened to it? It disappeared. No, Miss Finch said very quietly. Windows do not disappear. Mrs. Pritchard closed her eyes. They built over it. The room became perfectly still. Miss Finch looked once more at the sketch. At the impossible fifth window. At the narrow door drawn beside the studio. Then slowly, she understood something that no clue alone could have revealed. The hidden room beyond the studio had never been entered through the studio at all. It had once possessed its own entrance, its own window, its own purpose. The portrait had not been hidden inside an old room. The room itself had been hidden around the portrait. Before anyone could speak, a sharp sound echoed somewhere high above them. Glass breaking. Not in the gallery. Beyond the gallery. Exactly where the missing fifth window should have been. Chapter 10. The morning Nightingale house finally revealed the truth. The glass broke only once. After that, Nightingale house became so quiet that every person in the drawing room seemed to hear the silence falling from the ceilings. Miss Finch was the first to move. She took the candle, though dawn had already begun to pale the edges of the curtains, and walked toward the staircase. Clara followed close behind. Julian came next, carrying the brass key wrapped in its faded ribbon. Mrs. Pritchard moved slowly, as if each step returned her to a younger self she had spent 30 years trying to bury. Mrs. Vale came last. In the gallery, the air smelled of dust, rain, and cold stone. At first, nothing looked changed. 4 windows stood along the outer wall, silver with morning mist. The locked studio door remained shut. The portraits watched in their dim old patience. Then Miss Finch walked not to the door, but to the wall beside it. She counted the windows. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then she stood before the place where the fifth should have been. The paneling there seemed no different from the rest, but when Julian lifted the lamp higher, a fine line appeared in the wood, vertical and almost invisible. Near the floor, a flake of plaster had fallen away. Behind it was darkness. Mrs. Pritchard began to weep softly. "I saw them build it over," she whispered. "I was young. I thought if a thing was covered long enough, it became gone." Miss Finch touched the panel. "No, Mrs. Pritchard, only patient." The brass key did not fit the studio door. It fit a narrow lock concealed beneath a carved strip of oak. The panel opened inward, with a sigh like a breath held too long. Beyond lay a small room. Morning entered through a cracked, hidden window recently broken from within. Dust shone in the thin light. On one wall stood shelves of old pigments, brushes stiff as twigs and jars clouded by age. Against the far wall, covered in blue damask, rested a tall portrait. No one moved. Miss Finch crossed the room and opened the shutters wider. A pale bar of sunlight fell across the wrapped canvas. "Now," she said. Clara untied the damask with trembling fingers. The cloth slipped away. Lady Evelyn Whitmore looked out at them. She was young in the painting, not beautiful in any empty way, but alive with intelligence. Her blue sleeve glimmered where the torn fragment had once belonged. A nightingale perched near her shoulder, its face bright and delicately painted. But it was not Lady Evelyn who made Clara gasp. Behind her, half hidden in shadow, stood a young man. The painter had placed him almost invisibly at first glance, as though he belonged to the background. Yet sunlight revealed what lamplight could not. His face appeared beneath a glaze of dark varnish, clear enough now to recognize. Julian staggered back. "That is my father." "No," Mrs. Vale said quietly. Her voice had lost all its hardness. "That is Thomas Harrow." The name settled over the room. "The painter," Clara whispered. Mrs. Vale nodded. "And the man everyone believed had died." Miss Finch looked at the portrait with gentle satisfaction. "He was never dead." "No," Mrs. Vale said. "He was sent away." Piece by piece, the house gave up what it had kept. Thomas Harrow had not been merely a painter. He had loved Eveline, and Eveline had loved him. Sir Alistair had discovered it before the portrait was finished. In fury and pride, he spread the story that Harrow had died abroad, then forced him from England with money and threats. Eveline, already carrying Harrow's child, refused to let the truth vanish entirely. She asked Harrow to paint himself behind her shoulder, hidden beneath shadow, so one day the portrait might prove what words could be denied. "The child," Clara said. Mrs. Vale closed her eyes. "Julian's father." Julian stared at her. "My father was not a Whitmore. He was Harrow's son," Mrs. Vale said. "Raised under this roof because Eveline begged me to protect him. Alistair agreed, but only after the portrait disappeared and Harrow was declared dead. He thought blood mattered more than mercy. In the end, mercy outlived him." Julian sat heavily upon the old chair. All his inheritance, all his name, all his certainty had altered without leaving the room. "And Sir Alistair?" he asked. Mrs. Vale looked toward the broken window. "He came here the night he died. Someone had sent him Lady Eveline's note. He saw the portrait again. He understood that the truth had survived him. His heart failed before he could destroy it." Miss Finch spoke softly. "And the messages?" Mrs. Pritchard raised her head. "Mind." Clara turned. "You." "The envelope from below, the lilies, the sketch." Her voice shook. "After Sir Alistair died, I knew it had to end, but I was afraid I could not tell it plainly. I thought Miss Finch would understand what I could not say." "And the woman in the rain?" Julian asked. Mrs. Pritchard wiped her eyes. "My sister. She kept the broken nameplate all these years. She served here once before being dismissed for helping Lady Eveline." Miss Finch picked up one porcelain Nightingale from the shelf. Its head had not been broken. It had been wrapped and hidden beside the portrait. "Sir Alistair destroyed every Nightingale's face because the bird in the painting had won," she said. "A childish cruelty, perhaps, but guilt often behaves childishly when it cannot behave honestly." Mrs. Vale reached out at last and touched the painted blue sleeve. "I confessed," she whispered, "because I thought I was still protecting them." "No," Miss Finch said kindly. "You were protecting a silence that had grown too heavy for everyone." Morning filled the hidden studio slowly. No one spoke for a long while. Julian rose and stood before the portrait. His face was pale but calmer. "Then I am not who I thought I was." Clara took his hand. "Perhaps you are more." He looked at her, then at Mrs. Vale. "No more lies," he said quietly. Mrs. Vale bowed her head. "No more lies." By noon, the portrait of Lady Eveline was carried down into the hall and hung once more in the empty place where the wallpaper had waited 30 years. Outside, for the first time since Miss Finch had arrived, a bird began to sing among the yews. It was a small sound, almost uncertain, but clear. Miss Finch stood at the open door, her leather case in hand, and looked back once at Nightingale House. Sunlight touched the carved stone bird above the entrance, still headless, still wounded, yet no longer frightening. Behind her, Clara and Julian stood beneath Lady Eveline's portrait, looking not at the vanished past, but at one another. And in the quiet hall, where silence had once ruled like a locked room, the morning light rested gently on the face of the nightingale that had finally been allowed to sing.